Had the decision of whether or not to fire McCarthy been left up to just the Republicans, if the Democrats were on the sidelines, as their words and behavior during the debate would indicate, had it been a Republican vote on a Republican problem, the score would have been 210-8, and Kevin McCarthy would still be the speaker by a landslide, and the House would be open and maybe working on some funding bills right now. But no, Democrats chose to tip the scales. All Democrats in attendance voted in partnership with the Gates gang, with the Caucus of Chaos, and the final vote was 216-210. Kevin McCarthy was fired, which has essentially shut down the House of Representatives.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 282nd episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Now, I started this podcast in the fall of 2012 because I saw things happening in Congress that no one was talking about, and a lot has gone down over the last 11 years. And over those years, Congress has always been dysfunctional. But these last 2 weeks, the dysfunction hit a new low. Because as of this recording, the position of Speaker of the House is vacant, and the House of Representatives has effectively been shut down. And this is because the House of Representatives has voted to remove Speaker Kevin McCarthy from his job, which is the first time that the House of Representatives has voted to remove a speaker in all of U.S. history. And that vote to fire the speaker was triggered because Speaker McCarthy created a bill that kept our government funded and operational, a bill that was supported by the vast majority of the members of Congress. And if that doesn't sound like a thing that a speaker should be punished for, well, like I said, we've hit a new low. And so today I'm going to document what just went down. Because as Congress has lurched us from crisis to crisis over the course of the life of this podcast, I find myself going back to old episodes of this show to remind myself of what went down during that shutdown, or during that debt ceiling crisis, or what was jammed into that multi-thousand-page government funding law. I've found that Congressional Dish has become an audio documentary of congressional history. And while I don't think that this chapter of U.S. history is going to be easily forgotten, sometimes the details get lost, or I can't remember why something that seems to make no sense kind of made sense at the time, or I forget the emotions of the moment. And I want to be able to remember this because it feels like a turning point somehow. And the feeling, it's not a good one. Which is giving me whiplash, because just 2 days before the removal of the speaker, I was actually feeling hopeful. Hopeful that the crazies were sidelined and the sensible people in both parties would be working together more often to at least stop crises from happening. And I was hopeful that government shutdowns might be a thing of the past. But how quickly all that hope was dashed. This story has a vastly different ending than the one I thought I'd be telling you today. But before I get into all the details of all the craziness, I do think there are some basics we need to go over about how Congress is supposed to function. And I know that you probably know this stuff already, but this is one of those episodes that attracts newbies, people that don't pay a lot of attention to politics but want to know what the hell is going on. And we don't teach civics anymore in U.S. high schools. I was in my 30s when I learned about this process, and I only learned about it because I was producing Congressional Dish. And so here's a quick civics lesson before we get into the drama. So, the government funding cycle. The U.S. Congress, their most basic job, is to decide how our nation collects and spends federal money. The U.S. Congress needs to pass bills every year that determine how our national funds will be spent. And a bill, any bill, can only become a law when it passes both the House of Representatives and the Senate in identical form and then is signed by the president. Right now, the majority of the House of Representatives are members of the Republican Party, and the majority of the members of the Senate are members of the Democratic Party. And the president right now is Joe Biden, and he's a Democrat, which means that neither of those parties can write and pass funding bills into law without the other. Cooperation between Republicans and Democrats is a requirement. Now, all budget bills, according to the Constitution, must originate in the House of Representatives. Although the Senate will often take a bill that has passed in the House, delete all of the text, and then paste whatever budget bill they want onto the blank pages of the theoretically House-passed bill, even though it's only passed the House in name only at that point. It's a clever run around the Constitution, and it happens all the time. But the funding process is supposed to begin in the House. And the way that this is supposed to work is that there are 12 categories of spending, and there are 12 appropriations committees in the House, which are assigned to carefully work on the spending levels for each category. Each of those 12 appropriations committees in the House are supposed to produce a funding bill for their assigned category, ideally by the late spring time period, which then get passed by the full House. Now, that voting in the House of Representatives should be done by early summer, because funding bills passing the House is only the first step in the funding process. Because when the bills pass the House, they are then sent to the Senate, which also has 12 appropriations committees, one for each funding category. The Senate committees are supposed to have enough time to comb carefully through the hundreds of pages per funding bill and either approve the bill as it is, sending the House version to the Senate floor for a vote, or the Senate committees can make changes, which in situations like our current one, when the House bill is written by the other party, the Senate usually does make changes. And if the Senate committees or senators during the Senate floor vote make any changes at all to the funding bill, then there's supposed to be enough time for the House and the Senate to have a conference about that funding bill, work out their differences so that the final version can be identical in both the House and Senate, and then their compromise version can be voted on and passed in both the House and the Senate. And then those bills can be given to the president to be signed. This entire process takes time. And the good news is that Congress has time. They have 9 full months to get this done because the deadline isn't until the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. But the Congresses of most of my lifetime, regardless of party control, and regardless of if the president is Clinton, W, Obama, Trump, or Biden, the Republicans and Democrats in Congress have failed to enact all 12 funding bills on time every single year since 1996. Which means that the failure to meet the deadline to do their most basic job, funding the government and keeping it operating, is common and bipartisan. Which also means that the solutions to their failures are common and bipartisan as well. The first thing that needs to be done when they know that they can't hit their September 30th deadline is they need to extend their deadline. Because if they don't extend their own deadline and funding expires, many parts of the federal government no longer have money and or oftentimes no longer have permission to keep doing their jobs and have to shut down operations until funding resumes. And it is bad when this happens. Shutdowns are never good, which I feel like I need to say because it has somehow become cool to hate on the U.S. government all the time. You know, I really think it started to be cool when the cool actor and corporate spokesman turned president, Ronald Reagan, said that
the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
And people heard him say that and they went, yeah. But the federal government does things that are essential to your life and so constant that you don't notice them, or for too many, appreciate them. And the federal government doesn't stop doing them, even during a shutdown, because they are essential and can't be shut down because the consequences could be deadly. So members of the military keep guarding our 750-ish military bases peppered through 80 countries all over the world, many in countries where the residents don't want them there. Members of the Coast Guard keep saving people from drowning at sea. National Weather Service employees keep analyzing weather data and issuing tornado warnings. And air traffic controllers keep being our eyes to the skies and making sure that our airplanes don't crash into each other. If services like these shut down, people would die. And so instead, those people and so many others who do essential and invisible, important jobs simply keep doing their jobs and their paychecks are delayed. And then there's other people in the federal government who also do essential jobs but don't have immediate life and death determining types of jobs. Well, those other federal employees, like people who inspect our food for poisons, cancer researchers, the nice people who keep national parks open and clean. Well, they can't perform those services for us during a shutdown, but we still pay them after the fact, and we pay them for doing nothing. And if that sounds like a good deal for federal workers, it's not, because they have their paychecks delayed, just like the lifesavers do, and they still have to do all their work when they get back. Their to-do list is just longer. But imagine if your paychecks just suddenly stopped coming for a month. 2 or 3 paychecks in a row just don't show up, and you don't know when they're going to restart again. How would that feel? And would you be able to pay off all your bills? All bills, no income in the meantime? And for how long could you do that? Because that's the position that shutdowns put millions of American workers in. Shutdowns are dangerous. Shutdowns cost money. They cost everyone money. You know, like I said, there's obviously costs to the workers who are just like you and I, normal people just doing their jobs. But there's also costs to the government when you have to restart complicated systems. And the stock market also tends to tank when there's a shutdown. So even the shareholder class takes a hit. It's all bad. And using the threat of a shutdown, which endangers and harms so many as leverage, is not something Jesus would do. Shutdowns are not normal, even though they're starting to feel that way. You know, before I was born in the early 1980s, shutdowns simply didn't happen because A, no one wanted them, but B, no one was ruthless enough to use functional government as leverage to get extreme demands to become law. But during my lifetime, there have been 14 shutdowns, most of them for just a couple of days, but some have lasted for weeks. The longest was about 5 weeks, and they're trending in the longer direction. The long shutdowns began when Newt Gingrich became the Republican Speaker of the House and fundamentally changed the way Congress functions for the partisan, for the worse. When in 1995, bleeding into 1996, there were 2 shutdowns totaling 26 days and a battle that was about spending. And Newt Gingrich and the Republicans lost their fight with then President Bill Clinton. And then, since I've been producing this podcast, the Republican Party has treated us to 2 more long, unnecessary shutdowns. There was the 2013 shutdown, which was the one when Republicans used a shutdown to try to eliminate the Affordable Care Act, a law from 2010 which essentially put rules in place that stop health insurance companies from taking our health insurance premiums and providing us with no actual health care in return. Let me just reiterate that. The Republicans shut down our government because the prospect of health insurance companies having to follow rules and provide health care, it was that offensive to them. Now, that shutdown lasted for 16 days, ending after Republican Speaker John Boehner made a deal with the Democrats to reopen the government. Cooperation was the solution, and the Republicans got absolutely nothing out of using functional government as leverage. But learning no lessons, the Trump years then brought us the longest shutdown in U.S. history. And that one actually wasn't entirely the fault of Congress. Now, of course, that Congress of the Pelosi, McCarthy, Schumer, McConnell era did once again fail to do their job and fund the government on time, setting the stage for all of this. But it was the Republican president, President Donald Trump, who refused to sign any government funding bill unless he got almost $6 billion to build a border wall along our southern border. In the end, the government was reopened without the funding for his weird wall obsession, but then he tried some possibly unconstitutional shit to fund it later. But the main point is, it was another Republican shutdown, and it was another total failure. In all of these instances, the Republicans were trying to attach controversial things to the bill that would extend their funding deadline, a bill known as a continuing resolution, or a CR. And I've seen dozens of CRs become law. And when they are clean, when they are not stuffed full of legislative dingleberries hitchhiking their way into law, well, clean CRs, even ones that fund the entire government, can be like 10 pages long. They're very straightforward. They just change dates. And what they do is that they simply extend the authorities and funding levels from the previous year until the new funding deadline. But the Republicans tried to attach things: deep spending cuts, a repeal of a healthcare law, a border wall. They tried to attach unpopular things to the CR, threatening the operation of the entire U.S. government if they didn't get what they wanted. Not what Jesus would do. But the scandal, every time, is always in the dingleberries. It's not the CRs themselves. Although, that said, I should mention that while the clean CRs that extend the funding deadline are not themselves a big deal, government agencies do hate when they're in effect because they often have to function on less money than they say they need due to inflation. No new projects can begin under a CR, and no new contracts can be signed during a CR. Our military in particular has been very vocal about how harmful it is to constantly find ourselves operating under CRs every fall or longer due to congressional dysfunction. Here's Mike McCord. He's our Undersecretary of Defense, testifying to the House Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense on January 12, 2022.
The 6 longest CRs in the history of the Defense Department have all occurred in this last 12-year period. We have turned a 12-month fiscal year into an 8-month fiscal year in terms of our ability to initiate new starts and enter contracts. This should be unacceptable and not the new normal. It's hard to see this full impact because, or the inefficiency from looking from outside, because the organization has, of course, adapted to its circumstances, just as organisms do. Nobody plans to enter into contracts in the first quarter of a fiscal year now because the odds that we would actually be able to do so are so low. Therefore, we in turn have no significant contract delays to report to you when we're under a CR.
They shouldn't have to do that. Congress should get their work done on time. But for well over 2 decades and counting, they haven't. And so CRs being signed into law by October 1st and extending Congress's deadline every year, CRs on October 1st are the modern day norm. And as I record this, we are now operating once again under a CR. This one is valid for 45 days until November 17th. And on November 17th, either all 12 funding bills need to be law or another CR deadline extender bill will be needed. So as I tell you this story today, please keep in mind that the next crisis is already scheduled and it's only a few weeks away. And this lurch from CR to CR has become common in my lifetime too, although some years are far more dramatic than others, with this year being off the charts bonkers. But most of the time, and I've been screaming about this annually for a decade, most of the time, Congress burns all the extra time that they buy themselves with the first CR, and then they postpone their deadline again, and they postpone it again until 5 minutes before Christmas vacation, which is when the party leaders present a multi-thousand-page funding bill with all 12 funding bills or whatever funding bills never got finished, all crammed into one monstrous body of text, which is then not allowed to be amended by anyone and is passed without anyone having a chance to read it because it's simply impossibly long. These unacceptable monster funding bills are known as omnibus bills, and I hate them more than I hate just about anything in Congress. I've seen omnibus bills be over 4,000 pages long, and they are never available to read for more than a few days before the vote. It's an unconscionable way to govern because all kinds of things get slipped into law under the cover of thousands of unreadable pages. And I know the workload well, and bills that long to really understand take months to examine, which is why Congress has been given 9 of them. 9 full months to pass 12 funding bills through the House, the Senate, compromise, pass them again, and get them signed by the president. Or else they use a CR to extend their deadline, and it all stops when they finish the proper funding process or unleash the monster bus, the omnibus, with multiple bills smashed into one. So, that's the process. And now that you're up on the congressional lingo, here's the play-by-play of the drama that led to Speaker Kevin McCarthy getting the boot less than halfway through his congressional term. So at the beginning of this Congress, in a process that is normally just a formality, the election of the Speaker of the House, well, that turned into a total circus that dragged on for days when it took 15 votes for the Republicans to confirm Kevin McCarthy as their Speaker, because the Democrats all voted for the leader of their party, Hakeem Jeffries. This chaos in the Republican caucus was caused by a small group of Republicans, largely the same group of people that brought us to the brink of a shutdown last week. But this small group of Republicans refused to vote for McCarthy, and so the Republicans kept coming up a few votes short of confirming him. And so after the 14th failure, Kevin McCarthy retreated to one of the smoky back rooms in Congress and made a verbal deal with some of those Republicans. Now, much of that deal is unknown to the public because it wasn't put in writing. But we know that spending cuts were promised and that there was talk of a return to so-called regular order, as in passing all 12 funding bills on time and using a process that allows everyone in the House the opportunity to add amendments before the final vote. But one part of the deal was in writing. It was made an official rule of the House. And that was that the threshold needed to trigger a vote to remove the Speaker was lowered to just one member of the House. And that's how Matt Gaetz even had the ability to trigger the vote to fire Kevin McCarthy as Speaker this week. But Kevin McCarthy really, really wanted to be Speaker of the House. And so he made a deal with the Devils and empowered them to an unprecedented degree. And Kevin McCarthy was then confirmed as Speaker. Flash forward 6 months, and our nation was about to hit the debt limit. Again, in a crisis that I detailed for you in episode 275 called Debt Ceiling 2023 Crisis Normalized. During that unnecessary crisis, some House Republicans wanted to use the threat of a national default to get the Democrats to agree to gutting the Inflation Reduction Act, which I read and summarized for you, and the Democrats got that into law last year. And some House Republicans wanted to enact drastic spending cuts or else. Even though, despite it being due months prior, the Republicans hadn't even published their proposed budget yet. You can listen to episode 275 for the play-by-play of the debt ceiling crisis, but in the end, the Fiscal Responsibility Act became law after Speaker Kevin McCarthy made a deal with Democrats, President Biden in particular, to produce a new law that, most importantly, would suspend the debt limit until January 1st, 2025. Which, by the way, means that this same Congress will get one more crack at the debt ceiling crisis at the end of next year, during a lame duck session, which is when a bunch of members of Congress will have already gotten fired via the 2024 election, but will still have power, nothing to lose, and nothing to hold them accountable. That's going to be fun. But back to the bill that suspended the debt ceiling and rescheduled the crisis. In return for stopping a default on our national debt, the House Republicans got the legalization of some corporate environmental damage, and they got some spending cuts. And those cuts were put in there basically by capping the spending levels for 2024 and 2025. And by the way, just as a side note, after the Republicans caused a debt ceiling crisis in 2011, the S&P credit rating agency downgraded our national credit rating, which indicates that gambling on the U.S. being able to pay our loans with interest to the shareholder class is no longer a risk-free bet. And then after this summer's Republican-caused debt ceiling crisis, another credit rating agency, Fitch, downgraded our credit rating to no longer risk-free as well. But what's most relevant to today's story is that Kevin McCarthy made a deal with Democrats and didn't send our country over a fiscal cliff because Matt Gaetz, Andy Biggs, Dan Bishop, Bob Good, Matt Rosendale, and the rest of the government-hating, stunningly reckless wing of the Republican Party wanted to use our entire economy as a hostage in order to get controversial ideas into law in an undemocratic manner. And so, with the debt ceiling crisis rescheduled to be the grand finale of this crazy Congress, the House got to work on funding the government. Sort of. Because by the time their summer break arrived, their 6-week summer break that didn't end until mid-September, well, by the time summer break arrived, they were way behind schedule on government funding. By the time summer break arrived, only 10 out of the 12 House funding committees had even written a funding bill, and only one of those bills had passed the House, the one that funds military construction and veterans. That was the only one that got a vote. And in this episode show notes, which I forgot to say this earlier, but I provide all of my sources for you for everything that I talk about. So you don't have to trust me about anything. And in this episode show notes, you'll find a link to one of the most useful charts in Congress watching, which is the chart that tells you the status of all of these funding bills. In that chart, you can see the dates on all of the necessary votes from the committees to the House floor, the Senate floor, to the president's desk. It's all there. And on top, there is a super simple count that tells you what is complete. So right now, for example, as I record this episode, 6 days after the funding deadline, the bills passed chart says House, 4 of 12, Senate, 0 of 12, both chambers, 0 of 12, vetoed, 0 of 12, signed by President, 0 of 12. And you can also use the drop-down menu to go back to previous years to compare the dysfunction levels. It's a great chart. Highly recommend. But the point is that the Republican Party-controlled House only passed one appropriations bill before Kevin McCarthy allowed them to f*** off for 6 weeks, not returning to work until September 12th. And the Democratic Party-controlled Senate, well, they passed 0 funding bills and did the same f***ing off. It was a bipartisan dereliction of duty for which they all deserve to be fired for in 2024. But is what it is, and so with 18 total days left to fund the entire government, our suntanned members of Congress returned to work in mid-September, and in the House, they found themselves in total gridlock. Because Speaker Kevin McCarthy tried to get to work on the 12 spending bills, but the chaos wing of his own party literally wouldn't let him. So first, he tried to start where the Republicans generally have the most consensus, providing obscene amounts of money for the military. He wanted the House to start by passing the defense funding bill. Now, the Democrats were automatic no's, and President Biden had already threatened a veto on the Republican defense spending bill. And this is because the bill included things like a prohibition on women in the military with unwanted pregnancies having their travel costs covered by their employer, the military, if they're stationed in a state that severely restricts abortion services. Because while most of us are free to choose what state we want to live in, members of the military do not have that freedom. They live where they are assigned to live by the U.S. military. And so it's fundamentally unfair to deny them legal healthcare services or make them pay out of pocket to travel because of the medieval laws of a state that they did not choose to live in. The Biden veto threat also objects to the Republican provision that would prohibit the collection and reporting of pollution data from military industrial complex corporations. And the Biden veto threat objects to the Republicans trying to shift Mexico from the command of the U.S. Northern Command to the U.S. Southern Command, which the commander-in-chief has said, quote, would disrupt North America's unified defense approach and create a seam between two combatant commands on the U.S. border, unquote. And I have no idea what's up with that, but maybe you do, and it just seemed noteworthy. I don't know why the Republicans would try to do that. And there's more, of course, in the Biden veto threat, but you get the idea. The defense spending bill that the Republicans produced was partisan, which meant two things. One, the bill was guaranteed to be changed by the Democrats, who control the Senate, and therefore, this was guaranteed to be a first draft and not the final version of the defense funding. And two, to pass the House, it would have to do so with only Republican votes. And the Republicans only outnumber Democrats right now in the House by 11. So it only takes a handful of Republicans to say no to something to stop anything partisan that Speaker McCarthy and the rest of the Republicans want to do. And a handful of Republicans decided to slam the brakes on the defense funding bill. Andy Biggs of Arizona, Matt Rosendale of Montana, Ken Buck of Colorado, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, and Dan Bishop of North Carolina voted against even working on the defense funding bill. And then a few days later, Kevin McCarthy tried again to start work on the defense funding bill. But again, Andy Biggs of Arizona, Matt Rosendale of Montana, Dan Bishop of North Carolina, Eli Crane of Arizona, and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Well, that's the group this time that voted to stop them from even working on the funding bill. And so forget passing the 11 remaining bills through the House and then finishing all 12 via compromise with the Democrats who control the Senate and the White House. It was 1 week until the shutdown, and the Republicans couldn't even agree to start working on their partisan unfinished business. And then, over in the Senate was going to move forward with working on their appropriations bills, but Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin blocked the efforts over there. And so in both the House and the Senate, Republicans were blocking any work from happening in the 18 days that they had between vacation and shutdown. Until September 28th, that is, when in one day, the House Republicans passed 3 funding bills, full of partisan provisions that make them guaranteed to be changed by the Senate. So first, after weeks of blocking it, the House Republicans passed their defense bill that had all of those provisions that Biden has promised to veto. And House Republicans added some amendments that are crazy, like the one that reduces the salary of the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to $1. Then the House Republicans passed a partisan State Department funding bill that will also be changed by the Senate because it prohibits Mexico from getting economic support funds. It prohibits implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is an international agreement to reduce pollution. It defunds the Office of Palestinian Affairs and reduces Secretary of State Antony Blinken's salary to $1, among other things. And then they passed one more funding bill, the Department of Homeland Security funding bill, and same problem. It's guaranteed to be changed by the Senate because it reduces the salary of the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, to $1, reduces his Chief of Staff salary to $1, reduces the salary of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Director to $1. And on top of that, that bill would require that private prisons that cage immigrants be kept at full capacity, which means that it would be breaking the law to have an empty bed in a private immigration prison, which means that if someone is getting out, Immigration and Border Patrol would have to hunt for another human being to cage. This is a favored industry that is mind-bogglingly immoral. And so, obviously, the DHS funding bill will be changed by the Senate. But that's if it gets to the Senate at all, because get this. As noted by one of my favorite, not one of, my actual favorite congressional reporter, Jamie Dupree, in his Substack called Regular Order, which I never, ever miss and have linked to you in the show notes. Well, the Department of Homeland Security bill can't be given to the Senate because of a weird, unprecedented provision inserted by the House Republicans, which says that the bill is not allowed to be given to the Senate to work on until a bill written by the House Republicans about the border is signed into law. And I've never seen anything like that before. And Jamie Dupree hasn't seen anything like that either. And he's been a congressional reporter for about as long as I've been alive. And so when you hear Republican lawmakers complain that the Senate, controlled by Democrats, is not acting on House-passed spending bills, just know that it might be because House Republicans have put up sneaky roadblocks in their spending bills to make it impossible for the Senate to move forward with their part of the funding process. But the thing about those funding bills anyway, they were passed 2 days before the deadline. So even if they weren't stuffed full of partisan bullshit they knew wouldn't be acceptable to the Democrats in the Senate and the president, with these bills being completed only by the House within 48 hours of the deadline, that didn't leave enough time for the Senate to even read them, forget act on them. And so passing these funding bills on September 28th really didn't matter. The funding deadline needed to be extended with a CR, and everyone knew it. And so everybody started dreaming about what controversial dingleberries to attach to that CR. Now, the Democrats wanted one thing. The Democrats wanted billions to continue to fund the bloody, stalled war with Russia being fought over what will eventually be the eastern border of Ukraine. And in the Senate, the Democrats and Republicans together produced a CR that had about $6 billion for Ukraine and $6 billion for disaster relief for Americans. And that bill was moved forward in the Senate by a vote of 77-19. And by the way, on Twitter and Instagram, at Jen Briney, in the fog of chaos, as I was live updating you on all of this stuff, I said that the Senate CR had passed at this point, but I was wrong. The vote was to make the bill filibuster-proof, but at those numbers, it was clear that that bill had the votes it needed in the Senate to pass. It's a minor mistake, but when I'm wrong, I say I'm wrong. And in this case, I was wrong. But the point is that the Senate had a CR that was acceptable to the majority of senators. The House was always the problem, because there were some House Republicans who were just dead set against passing a CR. So in this little montage, you're going to hear Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee. You're going to hear Beetlejuice's biggest fan, Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado. And you're going to hear from the ringleader of the chaos circus, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida.
We do not need a continued resolution. We don't need to play any more games. We just need clean bills with real cuts to get our country back on track. With these continued resolutions, and they tell us to pass a continued resolution so we won't have to pass another continued resolution. Well, that line of thinking is like telling a crackhead that I'm going to give you more crack to get you off of crack.
We don't want continuing resolutions or omnibus bills. We want to go through the funding of the federal government bill by bill.
No continuing resolutions. Individual spending bills are bust.
Which is beyond dumb. If they passed a continuing resolution, the government would keep functioning while they worked on those 12 individual bills. They could still have 12 individual bills. If you want 12 separate bills, the thing you are against is the omnibus bill, and only an omnibus bill. A continuing resolution, a CR, has nothing to do with that. They are not the same thing. A CR just keeps government open while you work on the 12 bills. And so the question became, what do these people want that would get them to vote to keep the government open while they work on those 12 bills? But no one could figure out what exactly these people wanted. Here's Representative Ben Cline of Virginia, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, Tracy Mann of Kansas, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, and of course, Matt Gaetz of Florida.
We should make border security a condition of any continuing resolution when the fiscal year ends on September 30th.
Shutdown is not the best thing in the world, but continued path toward bankruptcy is not an option either for me.
Let's secure the border. Let's decrease our country's dependence on communist China. Let's commit to reining in government spending.
We have way too many bureaucrats.
And I don't think we should send another nickel to Ukraine.
And so what exactly did they want? You know, what could a genie put in a CR that would grant all of those not very clear wishes? No one knows. But Speaker McCarthy tried to appease them anyway. So first, a CR was presented by McCarthy in the House that included border security legislation, but which also cut funding for the Border Patrol because any program outside of defense and the Veterans Administration would have been cut by 8.1275%. So, whoopsie, that one didn't go forward. And then, less than 48 hours before the shutdown, Speaker McCarthy presented a psychotic 188-page CR that would have extended the funding deadline for just 1 month, just until Halloween, and then cut every program outside of the military, the Veterans Administration, Homeland Security, and disaster relief by 30% for the month of October. And it also would have made major changes to our immigration and border policies, which were problematic for so many reasons. So first of all, it would have increased spending, specifically increasing spending by billions on private for-profit sector technologies to help catch and cage poor people crawling through the desert. And it had some provisions that just weren't going to get approved by Senate Democrats, like the provision that would have created a program to poison a bunch of tall plants that brown poor people can find shade under along the Rio Grande River. What could possibly go wrong with that plan? And so this CR was designed to basically be a Matt Gaetz wet dream, minus the teenagers. And it was designed to cause a shutdown, but one that could be blamed on Senate Democrats. And if Matt Gaetz and friends wouldn't approve of this, what could possibly appease them? Well, nothing, apparently, because 21 members of the Gaetz gang said that this wasn't good enough for them and voted against the extremely partisan CR. Which proved that there was no CR that would ever get their votes. Here's Speaker McCarthy's assessment of who he was dealing with here.
This is a whole new concept of individuals that just want to burn the whole place down. It doesn't work.
And so, on the last morning before the shutdown, Speaker Kevin McCarthy made this announcement.
We will put a clean funding stopgap on the floor to keep government open for 45 days for the House and Senate to get their work done. We will also, knowing what had transpired through the summer, the disasters in Florida, the horrendous fire in Hawaii, and also the disasters in California and Vermont, we will put the supplemental portion that the President asked for in disaster there too, keeping the government open while we continue to do our work.
And he did this knowing that Matt Gaetz had publicly threatened multiple times that he would force a vote to fire McCarthy as Speaker if he put a bill like this forward for a vote. So, Kevin McCarthy knew he was putting his job in jeopardy if this CR passed with Democrats. Everyone knew it because he was committing a party loyalty sin, which is insane. There were 435 members of the House, and they are all supposed to be participating in the governing process. It is absolute madness that putting forward a bill designed to please the vast majority of the House of Representatives is, in any universe that makes any sense, considered a sin. The idea that governing for one party is normal is a breed of DC brainworms in desperate need of genocide. But there was a problem with his so-called clean CR, which McCarthy was risking his speaker job for. When the bill text was released, it was clear just from the number of pages that it might not, and in fact, wasn't a clean CR. Like I said before, I've read dozens of CRs at this point, and a truly clean one need not be more than 10, 20 pages max. But the McCarthy clean CR was 71 pages. And he gave the members of the House of Representatives only 47 minutes to read it, to do the text hopping necessary to figure out what it changes in current law and to make up their minds. Now, this is a task that took me a few hours. And so I can tell you, 47 minutes, it wasn't enough time. And so the Democrats played some games to stall the vote and buy themselves some time to read it. So first, the House Democrats put forward a motion to adjourn, which is basically a request to close the House and go home, even though none of them wanted to close the House and go home. They wanted to fund the government, but they put forward this request to go home and asked for a recorded vote, which bought them 15 minutes of vote time. Then all the Democrats voted no on the motion to go home by hand, which stalled the end of the vote even longer. Then the leader of the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, used the power granted to him to speak as long as he wants in his position as top dog Democrat to ramble for a while, buying 52 more minutes to read the bill. And during this time, Representative Jamal Bowman of New York pulled the fire alarm in the Cannon office building, which I have to admit, I thought he did it to stall the vote when I first saw the picture of him pulling the fire alarm that came from security cam footage. It was clearly him, and he used to be the principal of a school, and so I thought it was pretty funny for him to be pulling a page out of a classic shithead student playbook. But the Capitol Police actually conducted an investigation into this, and it didn't take long for them to figure out what happened. Representative Bowman, who's a relatively new member of Congress, was trying to get from the Cannon office building, which is a completely separate building from the House of Representatives, where all the drama was taking place. Well, he was trying to get from the Cannon office building to the House floor to vote. And he went to a door that's usually propped open during the week, but this was a Saturday. The door was closed. The door was an emergency exit door, and what the tape shows is that Bowman tried to open the door, couldn't, and then pulled the handle on the wall, thinking it might open the door, but instead, it was a fire alarm. Which means that was pretty dumb. But the Capitol Police determined that it was an accident. And no matter what, accident or not, it could not have obstructed the official proceeding in the House because this all took place in a totally different building. And so anyone calling for Jamal Bowman to be prosecuted as if he was a bumpkin hee-haw storm in the Capitol on January 6th, anyone saying that is just a partisan hack. And also probably dumb. This whole fire alarm not a scandal is so dumb. But actually, I'm starting to think that everyone in DC is dumb at this point because all of this is so dumb. So dumb. But back to the not so clean CR. So, when I got the chance to read this thing and pull it apart, I discovered some dingleberries and some spending cuts in those 71 pages. But the dingleberries that were attached, I gotta tell you, were uncontroversial and necessary. So first, the CR that just became law included $16 billion for FEMA, our disaster aid, and that's available until it runs out. The CR also extends authorization and funding for the Federal Aviation Administration until the end of the year. The CR extends the flood insurance program, funding for community health centers, and other programs until November 17th, including personal responsibility education, aka abstinence education. Prudes. And the CR reauthorizes a compact of free association with the Federated States of Micronesia until November 17th, which basically allows us to continue to colonize the Northern Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean, using their islands as military bases in return for some taxpayer-funded services, but not accepting the islands as an actual state or granting their residents actual citizenship with actual rights. The CR also makes some changes to the approval process for pharmaceutical drugs for animals, designed to speed up the approval process and authorizing fees and funding through 2028. Now, this had to be attached to the CR because the authorization for the approval and fee program was expiring on September 30th. But I've got to tell you that making animal drug application processes go faster concerns me because of the episode I produced about the Seresto flea and tick collars, which are being sold all over this country, even though it has been banned by Canada, because of our own FDA data showing that the combination of chemicals in the Seresto flea and tick collars seems to be killing quite a few pets and making their humans sick as well. The last Congress that was controlled by Democrats was doing an investigation into the poisonous Seresto flea and tick collars, but the House Republicans killed that investigation. But what I'm trying to tell you here is, 1, don't use Seresto flea and tick collars, and 2, if poisonous pet collars have made it through the application process, and we know they have, I'm not sure that speeding up the application process is the right move here. But I listened to a hearing about this, and it's uncontroversial in Congress, so that dingleberried its way into law. So none of that was going to be a problem with Democrats. But a clean CR isn't supposed to have spending cuts, and this bill had spending cuts. So the CR cut $50 million that was supposed to be available until completely spent to repair rural community facilities that were damaged in natural disasters in 2022. And it cut $265 million that was supposed to be available until completely spent to repair rural water systems that were damaged by disasters in 2022. Which is one of those perfect examples of, if people in rural red state America knew what Republicans do with their power as opposed to what they say, rural working class people would never vote for Republicans. But no one reads laws and explains these things, so here we are. They can cut disaster funding for rural communities and get away with it. They also seem to be getting away with cutting $125 million from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. They are also cutting $210 million from the National Science Foundation, which was supposed to be used to implement the CHIPS Act. They also eliminated the ability for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to fund a partnership with Mexico that creates water treatment projects designed to protect residents in the United States on the U.S.-Mexico border from water pollution originating in Mexico, proving Republicans once again to be the party of pollution. And then the most significant cuts were applied to State Department funding. They cut $30 million from drug law enforcement in Ukraine. They cut $60 million from the State Department's diplomatic program that was specifically provided for diplomats responding to the situation in Ukraine. And they cut $920 million, almost $1 billion, from funding for assistance to Ukrainian refugees, specifically removing funding for food and shelter for people in Ukraine. And this is on top of the fact that the one dingleberry that was super important to the Democrats and President Biden was the one in the Senate CR that would have provided more billions for the proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. So the Senate CR had Ukraine war funding. The McCarthy CR did not. And then the McCarthy CR had additional cuts to Ukraine refugee assistance as well, which, by the way, those cuts were not clear in the text of the bill. The way these cuts were presented, I saw that big numbers from old laws were being deleted and replaced with smaller numbers. But it took me some time to find the current law and jump back and forth to figure out what exactly was being cut. And Kevin McCarthy did not intend to give the House enough time to read this bill before the vote. And so between the way all of this was unclearly written and the inclusion of the rural disaster aid cuts, I don't think these were intended to be poison pills. I think they were intended to slip into law undetected. But I really don't know, nor do I have any way to find out, as I am not a DC swamp creature and have no connections to any of these people. But the Democrats were able to buy themselves some time to read the CR. And the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, did complain on the House floor about something that she caught in the text of the CR. Or to be more accurate, something that was not in the CR that she thought should be.
There are many changes between this bill, as a gentleman asked me, and the Senate bill. There are many changes. The gentleman from New York should understand that there are many changes between this bill and the Senate bill. Here is one that I believe the majority will not mention. They amend the Senate bill to give themselves a pay raise. A pay raise. It's there. Yeah. You can look at me, you can smile, but what you did was you amended the Senate bill to give yourselves a pay raise while you have threatened day in and day out service members, you have threatened workers across this country, and you've said to them, we don't really care about you and whether or not you can support your family. We don't care about that. No. We mainly care about ourselves and our pay raise.
So you can hear that she was just oozing with disdain for these people. And the Republicans called foul on her accusation. But then the Republicans also made a quick edit to the CR and added the provision that was in the Senate's version that stopped the cost of living increase for members of Congress. And so, no, the CR that became law did not increase the pay of members of Congress. But the Republicans did try. But that said, I think there is way too much attention being paid to this because most of the members of Congress are millionaires and they don't depend on their congressional salary. Instead, they make their millions by gambling on the likely success and failures of businesses in the stock market, which they're allowed to do even though as lawmakers they have the power to change the fortunes of companies. And so if you're finding yourself upset about congressional compensation, focus on that, please. Their meager cost of living increases are pennies compared to the vast riches that some of them are collecting as members of the shareholder class who are permitted to gamble on individual companies despite their power to influence the fortunes of those same companies. And honestly, I wouldn't have even brought this up, this whole cost of living thing, except some of you asked. And it was the only thing that was brought up by Rosa DeLauro and the Democrats as an objection to the CR. And I don't know what to think about that. Because the CR passed the House a few hours before the funding deadline. It passed 335 to 91. With all of the Democrats, except for one who wanted the extra Ukraine war funding, they all voted for it. And what I can't figure out is the spirit in which that CR was presented by Kevin McCarthy, in the spirit in which it was passed by the Democrats. Because in the good faith argument, Speaker Kevin McCarthy presented a CR that the Democrats ultimately voted for en masse. It did have sneaky cuts, but they were sneaky. They were not obvious. And he didn't want to allow much time for people to find them, making me think that they may have been intended to be dingleberries and not poison pills. But the bad faith argument is that there were almost $1 billion in cuts for Ukrainian refugees in there, and a few $100 million taken back from rural communities in the United States. And even though it wasn't easy for me to quickly spot that, members of Congress have staff, and the staff members on the appropriations committees often know these bills backwards and forwards. And the number changes were big. I spotted those immediately. And so they could have been poison pills intended to get Democrats to vote against the CR and be blamed for a shutdown. But the Democrats just didn't take the bait. I really don't know what the dynamic truly was. And it does matter because 2 days later, Kevin McCarthy would be fired as Speaker of the House, and the Democrats chose to play active roles in his firing. But for a minute there, before I knew about the details about the cuts in the CR, it appeared that rational people, the majority of the House of Representatives acting as members of the House as opposed to members of their parties, had banded together to do the rational thing. They kept the government operating while they worked on the overdue funding. And the majority of the House had voted together to stop chaos. And they had sidelined the Burn It All Down caucus, most notably their ringleader, Matt Gaetz of Florida. And Matt Gaetz was furious. And so immediately after Speaker McCarthy did the sensible thing and put forward the clean-ish CR, which passed with a huge majority of the House voting yes, Representative Stephanie Bice of Oklahoma offered a motion to adjourn right away and send the House members home for the weekend, forcing the Senate to pass the McCarthy CR or nothing. And while the Speaker pro tempore, so the dude with the gavel who at the time was Representative Steve Womack, while Womack was gaveling out the House to send our representatives home for the rest of the weekend, Matt Gaetz made a beeline for one of the microphones. And the widely assumed reason was so that he could put forward a motion to vacate and try to get McCarthy immediately fired as Speaker of the House. And I am 99% sure that Steve Womack saw Matt Gaetz. He looked right at him, and Womack ignored Matt Gaetz while looking at him straight in the eyes. He slammed down the gavel with a slam that sounded like America collectively saying, "Fuck you, Matt Gaetz." And then Matt Gaetz walked off the crowded House floor all by himself. It was a very satisfying scene. And then after that, the CR passed the Senate 88-9. All the no's were Republicans. And it was signed by President Biden just in time to avoid a shutdown. And that's where I thought this episode was going to end, with a sad Matt Gaetz all by himself walking off the floor. You know, on a happy note. You know, sanity saved the day in the House of Representatives. I was happy. I was excited to record this episode and be the bearer of good news. I was excited to give you hope that cooperation between sane enough Republicans and sane enough Democrats seemed to be blossoming, at the very least in situations where an unnecessary crisis needed to be averted. I was excited to tell you that there were, in fact, adults in the lawmaking room. But how quickly all those good vibes disappeared. Because on Monday, Matt Gaetz filed his motion to vacate, which set up a vote to fire Kevin McCarthy as Speaker on Tuesday. But Matt Gaetz, nor anyone else involved, had a replacement Speaker lined up. You know, I've labeled Matt Gaetz and his friends in Congress government wrecking balls. And this is a perfect example of why I say that. Because he set out to destroy the Speaker and to stop the work of the House itself, with no plan to rebuild and get back to work. And before the vote took place, there was an hour-long debate on whether or not firing Kevin McCarthy was a good idea. And Republican after Republican stepped up to the microphone to passionately argue their side. Those on the fire McCarthy side made it clear that they wanted to use functional government as leverage. Here's Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona.
This is a lawless Biden regime. They will not enforce border laws. And we can pass them till we're blue in the face. But until you leverage the budget and the spending, you will not see enforcement by this administration.
They made it clear that they wanted a shutdown, and they were proud of it. Here's Matt Gaetz, Florida man.
The week before we moved on to those single subject appropriations bills, the plan was another CR. He pitched a CR. They tried to get us to vote for a CR, and only when a brave few said we are done governing by continuing resolution. We are here to eulogize the era of continuing resolution. We will not do it. We will not pass it.
And they made it clear that the Saturday CR that was passed in cooperation with Democrats was their red line. It was the reason for the firing. Here's Representative Bob Good of Virginia.
A red line was crossed for me, I regret, on Saturday, and chose regret that I must vote against the motion to table as I did and to vote to vacate the chair.
And on the Keep McCarthy side were the vast majority of Republicans, including Representative Tom Massey, who's a member of the Freedom Caucus, where the Gaetz gang generally hangs out. And he's a person who, while I disagree with him often on some policies, he's also a person who has proven that he cares about the institution of the House of Representatives and how it functions. And this is what he said.
Mr. Speaker, as the
only still serving co-author and co-sponsor of the motion to vacate Speaker Boehner, I can tell you this motion to vacate is a terrible idea. As the only member who's serving here who took every chance to vote against Speaker Boehner and to vote against Speaker Ryan, I can tell you that this chamber has been run better, more conservatively, and more transparently under Mr. McCarthy than any other speaker that I have served under. As a member of the Rules Committee, one of three conservatives who were placed there out of trust, the Speaker gave us a blocking position by putting 3 of us on there to keep an eye on the Rules Committee to make sure the process was fair and even. I can tell you it's been fair and even. None of us are voting against the Speaker today.
And then there were people like Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, who spoke as an elder of the Republican Party.
This is a very sad day, and certainly a day I never expected to have to live through. I think broadly speaking, as I look across this floor, you can divide members into 3 groups. I'm very happy to be in the first group. The overwhelming majority of my party supports the Speaker that we elected. We're proud of the leadership he's shown. We're proud of the manner in which he's been willing to work with everybody in our conference and, I believe, in this chamber. There's a second group, small group. Honestly, they're willing to plunge this body into chaos and this country into uncertainty for reasons that only they really understand. I certainly don't. And then there are friends on the other side. I mean friends, honestly, with great sincerity. I have a lot of friends over there. And I recognize that my friends on the other side have a very complex set of partisan, personal, and political calculations to make. And I certainly wouldn't presume to give them any advice about that. But I would say, think long and hard before you plunge us into chaos, because that's where we're headed if we vacate the speakership.
And as Matt Gaetz and his friends argued for chaos, they did so from the microphones on the Democrats' side of the aisle. The Democrats, for their part, almost all of them in attendance, sat back silently and watched the debate from the sidelines. Not a single Democrat said a single word. And the reasons the Democrats gave for their sidelined position was that because this wasn't their fight. Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat, as crowned by Her Majesty Nancy Pelosi to be her successor, said in a strategy letter to the rest of the Democrats, quote, "It is now the responsibility of the Republican members to end the House Republican civil war," unquote. And Queen Pelosi herself, on the platform that will always be known as Twitter, said, quote, "The Speaker of the House is chosen by the majority party. In this Congress, it is the responsibility of the House Republicans to choose a nominee and elect the Speaker on the floor," unquote. And so the Democrats stayed silent and literally sat on the sidelines during the whole debate. Not a single Democrat stood up and said, maybe, just maybe, Kevin McCarthy has proven twice that there's a line he won't cross. The debt ceiling is, after all, above our heads, and the government is still operating today, so maybe he's not the worst Republicans can give us. Like, Jim Jordan wouldn't be fun for anyone. He's a partisan attack dog. He was in the White House meetings where the Chaos Caucus plotted how to keep Donald Trump president after he lost the election. So maybe we don't want that guy, number 3 in line to the presidency during the 2024 presidential election. Maybe we Democrats should consider that. No one said that. Not a single Democrat stood up and said, maybe, just maybe, it's a bad look in the history books to punish a speaker for working with us to keep the government operational. And maybe it's a bad look to vote in partnership with the Chaos Caucus to do anything right now. Maybe working with us is a behavior we want to encourage. Maybe. There was a debate to be had about this from the Democratic Party perspective, if they were going to participate in this vote. But every Democrat just sat there in giddy, smirky silence. And then the House voted. And during that vote, members of the House had 3 options. It wasn't just a yes or no option. They could vote yes to fire McCarthy, they could vote no to keep McCarthy, or they could vote present, as in, I'm physically here, but sitting on the sidelines because this vote does not concern me. And the Democrats, in lockstep, all of them, like sheep, followed the instructions sent to them by King Jeffries, and they all voted yes to fire McCarthy, and in doing so, overruled the wishes of the vast majority of Republicans. Because 210 Republicans voted to keep Kevin McCarthy as the Speaker, 8 Republicans voted to fire him. And those 8 are Andy Biggs of Arizona, Ken Buck of Colorado, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Eli Crane of Arizona, Bob Good of Virginia, Nancy Mace of South Carolina, and Matt Rosendale of Montana. But had the decision of whether or not to fire McCarthy been left up to just the Republicans, if the Democrats were on the sidelines, as their words and behavior during the debate would indicate, had it been a Republican vote on a Republican problem, the score would have been 210-8, and Kevin McCarthy would still be the Speaker by a landslide, and the House would be open and maybe working on some funding bills right now. But no, Democrats chose to tip the scales. All Democrats in attendance voted in partnership with the Gates Gang, with the Caucus of Chaos, and the final vote was 216-210. Kevin McCarthy was fired, which has essentially shut down the House of Representatives. And so in the end, the Chaos Caucus got their shutdown, just of the House of Representatives and not the whole government, but they'll take what they can get. For the Chaos Caucus, either shutdown is a win. And this was a win that they could not have gotten without the entire Democratic Party's help in the House, because the whole party was needed to participate in order to overrule 210 Republicans. It was a choice for Democrats to insert themselves into this decision, to fire the Speaker without knowing what would come next. They own some of this chaos now. It's a bipartisan chaos now. And I see a lot of exasperation online right now with people saying, well, you can't expect the Democrats to save McCarthy. He started an impeachment inquiry. A fake impeachment inquiry that hasn't gotten voted on and therefore granted no extra powers to the committee that was already investigating Hunter Biden, but impeachment inquiry. And you can't expect the Democrats to save McCarthy because the House spending bills were below the spending levels agreed to with President Biden. The first draft of spending bills that were guaranteed to be changed by the Senate and were nowhere near becoming law, but Democrats can't be expected to save him. He did so many bad things. But the thing is that not a single Democrat had to save McCarthy and vote for him. Not a single one. They didn't have to participate in the Republican circus at all. They chose to participate without independent thought or debate by any of them. And they were all kinds of smirky, looking around like, look at us over here winning, until the vote was called. It was a very, this is actually happening kind of moment. And it got real quiet.
The office of Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives is hereby declared vacant.
No claps, no giggles, stunned silence. And then a woman says, now what? A question that no one had seemed to have considered ahead of time. And it's sad. You know, I'm not a fan of Kevin McCarthy. He's a shit talker. He's untrustworthy. And I get why people don't like him. But this is the House of Representatives. This is our Congress. This is bigger than Kevin McCarthy. There was an opportunity after the CR passed for it to be a spark of good faith. Regardless of the actual intentions or suspicion of intentions, that bill passed. It was bipartisan. The government was functioning. And the motion to vacate was an opportunity for all the sane people from both parties who had just stopped the crisis to come together and sideline Matt Gaetz and the crazies, who have tried twice this year to threaten the functionality of our government and health of our economy, and to say to them, as the majority of the House of Representatives, that it won't be tolerated. To say that it is not a fireable offense to work with members of the other party to perform basic congressional responsibilities. This was an opportunity to vote as members of the House, not members of a party. But the Democrats chose to vote as members of a party, and they voted with the Chaos Caucus. And it's sad, man. The Democrats didn't have to be a part of this story at all. But when they chose to insert themselves, they sided with chaos. They voted to shut down the House because they knew there was no obvious next speaker, and the House can't operate until there is one. And so, what happened next, procedurally, is that based off of a list of chosen ones by Kevin McCarthy, Representative Patrick McHenry of North Carolina became the temporary speaker. That's our situation right now. And I don't know what he does and does not have the power to do as the temporary speaker, because this is the first time a speaker has been successfully fired midterm in U.S. history. So we're in uncharted waters here. But we do know that the next step that needs to be taken, which is that a new speaker needs to be elected for the House to reopen. And Kevin McCarthy has announced that he won't run again for speaker. So it's probably going to be someone else. And Jim Jordan wants the job. And Trump has endorsed Jim Jordan for the job. But other names are being thrown around as well. So who knows? All I know for certain is that the House is shut down for at least a week while politicking occurs. And the first vote on the next speaker is tentatively scheduled for Wednesday, October 11th, 1 month and 6 days before the next funding deadline. And as for Kevin McCarthy, he was remarkably chill after losing his speaker job in the press conference that occurred right after, where he not only gave a prepared speech, but also hung out for the better part of an hour and took questions from reporters.
If I lose my job over doing what I truly believe was right, I'm very at peace with it. You asked earlier, when did I decide? I knew they would make the motion on me. It didn't make one bit of difference. I felt very comfortable in that decision. And I think the American public believed that decision was right.
And I certainly think his decision to produce a bill that Democrats would vote for was right. Now, the sneaky cuts inserted into it, not right. 47 minutes to read 71 pages, not right. Democrats have legitimate reasons for thinking Kevin McCarthy is an untrustworthy weasel, and they're right. I don't trust the guy. But risking his speaker job, which he clearly loved and aspired to, by crafting a bill that could pass so the government could stay operational, that was the right thing to do. And it breaks my heart that that behavior was punished. It breaks my heart that this feels like the start of partisan war in Congress beyond anything I've seen yet. Because that new era of partisan war began right away. The only thing that temporary speaker Patrick McHenry has done, other than shut down the House for at least 8 days, is he ordered Nancy Pelosi, one of the few Democrats who actually did stay on the sidelines. She didn't vote. But she and Steny Hoyer, who's the longtime number 2 Democrat in the House, were told to pack up their things and get out of the special little offices that they have, which are located right off of the House floor. Their offices will now belong to former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And Nancy Pelosi in particular was told that her stuff needed to be moved immediately on Wednesday, even though she was en route already on a Tuesday night flight to California for Senator Dianne Feinstein's funeral scheduled for Thursday. It's a real dick move. And I'm not just talking about Dianne Feinstein clinging to power until she literally died in office. Taking those offices away was a dick move too. All kidding aside, for better or worse, Nancy Pelosi had worked with and been friends with Dianne Feinstein for decades. And so Patrick McHenry and Kevin McCarthy basically sent her a message that said, "We know your friend just died, and we don't give a f***. This is a new era of partisan hate, and we all better buckle up, because November 17th is coming up real quick, and who knows how long the House is going to be shut down for." And then there's the Senate. The Senate, well, they're gone again. The Senate is taking another 2 weeks away from Washington, D.C. because, I don't know, the Democrats are running that chamber, and they could work on spending bills without the House. Like I said before, they know their way around the Constitution well enough, and they know the spending bills don't really need to start in the House. But nope, they're gone. And so there's really no chance that any work on the funding bills will even begin until about 3 weeks before the deadline. And so another CR is almost certainly going to be needed on November 17th. And do you think Speaker Jordan is going to work with the Democrats, or do you think he's going to declare war? And then, after whatever happens on November 17th, one more crisis point you need to know about, which I imagine you'll start hearing about soon, is the upcoming sequester. Because a provision was put in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that's the law that lifted the debt ceiling, that says that if there is a CR in effect on or after New Year's Day, so if the government isn't funded for real by the end of the actual year, all spending, defense and non-defense, will be sequestered, meaning there will be a 1% across-the-board cut to everything. And that might not sound like a lot, but it actually equals many millions of dollars disappearing from every agency's budget. It's a recipe for chaos. And by the way, that same rule, real funding by New Year's or 1% cuts, that's going to be in effect for the end of next year, too. So like I said, buckle up. But as pessimistic and sad as I am about everything happening right now in Congress, there is a glimmer of hope that I gathered from all of this. A small step towards sanity that even the firing of Kevin McCarthy, as far as I can tell, hasn't dashed. And so I want to leave that with you today so that you don't hang yourself after listening to this episode. And so here's the hope. The hope is that sane Republicans, over the course of September, lined up one after another to say that they no longer support shutting down the government as a legislating strategy. Here's Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, Marionette Miller Meeks of Iowa, Kay Granger of Texas, and Michael Lawler of New York.
Shutting down the government is bad for the American people. It's an abdication of our responsibility. It's something we should not do.
I cannot justify shutting down our entire government over obscure policy decisions.
Today, the most important priority is keeping government open.
The bottom line here is this: we're not shutting the government down.
From the most shameless Republican personally, Representative George Santos of New York.
A shutdown would only hurt the very people who are putting their lives at risk for all of us.
To the most shameless Republican professionally, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky.
An entirely avoidable government shutdown would not just pause our progress on these important priorities, it would actually set them back.
The shutdown as leverage play has fallen out of favor with most Republicans. Finally. It only took 30 years of failures for them to get here, but they are here. And that, at least, is good news. That's the only thing that's good news. Good luck to us all. Thank you for listening to this episode. And please, if you learned something, please share this episode. I structured this episode so that anyone who listens does not have to be a political wonk to understand it, because we need more people in this country to pay attention and understand this stuff. We need Americans to start taking responsibility for our members of Congress because we need new people in there across the board. Both parties are so bad. And 2024 is our next chance for a mass replacement. And that's the real hope I have, that the next election is so soon. But I'm not famous, and this podcast is still way too small to make any kind of a difference. And only you can change that, and you can change that by sharing the episode. So please share it with your family members and friends and coworkers and anyone who expresses any interest in understanding what's going on and who isn't a party stooge. Please share this with your favorite podcasters who seem like they give a damn about what is happening in government and who are also not party stooges, because party stooges don't like this show. But play it in the car with your kids or your parents. You know, I have the golf swing over the swear words on the public feed for a reason. Please listen to this with others. Please share this, because we'll never change things if people don't understand what's going on. This level of dysfunction cannot be sustained. And of course, this podcast is listener supported. As in, you didn't hear any ads because I don't accept ad money. And I don't let any company or politician or anyone pay me to tell you anything. I want you to be able to trust me. And so instead, I produce these episodes up front, and you choose what they're worth, and you get to decide how much to pay for them afterwards. And so please support the show financially as well, because this long summer of Congress doing nothing has really taken its toll on the finances over here. And if it weren't for people who have set up regular payments via Patreon and PayPal and Zelle and paper checks, I'd be straight freaking out right now about the funding drop. I do need your support. And we need some growth. I need some growth for my mental health. We hit 1,000 patrons in May, and it's October, and we're up to 1,004. And with Congress getting crazier and crazier and with growth stuck, I just need your support right now, please. So please share the show and pay for it if you can. And it doesn't have to be a lot. This is a crowdfunded thing. What I need is more people. I'm genuinely happy with $1 to $5 per episode. Doesn't have to break the bank. Not everyone can be an executive producer, and that's okay. Although every dollar you send in does get you closer to an executive producer credit. That's how Matt Payne did it. Matt Payne has been producing this show for years. And episode by episode, he has now hit the 535 required to become an executive producer on an episode that he's proud of having funded. And he put that episode on the most valuable episode list with his executive producer credit, which is what determines what's on the list and how high up the episode is. And so Matt Payne is now an executive producer on Congressional Dish 176, Target Venezuela, Regime Change in Progress, which is an episode I produced after watching a crazy hearing during which strategies for overthrowing Venezuela's government were discussed, strategies that were then put in motion by the Trump administration during the dumbest failed coup attempt of all time. And about this episode, Matt said, quote, "This is one of the first times everything just kind of came together for me in terms of articulating the U.S. role in steering things to maximize profits for the investor class while simultaneously calling it democracy. You did a great job of this. Keep up the great work with the podcast. I recommend it to everyone I know," unquote. And I know you do, Matt. I've seen you do it on Twitter. So thank you so much for supporting this show by sharing it and by supporting it financially. And I'm very happy to share the credit for that episode with you. And I'm also, oh my God, I'm thrilled to see that Garrick Smalley is now an executive producer on Congressional Dish 281, Private Policing of the Organ Transplant Network. I knew that episode was good, and I'm so glad to get the validation because I have been stressing out a lot about that episode to the point that I actually re-recorded it. That episode was recorded using a microphone that was new, and I didn't think it sounded perfect, but I tend to be a perfectionist about this. I thought it was probably in my head. I released the episode, and then no one-time contributions came in for it almost at all. There was a handful. And the way that I receive feedback for a lot of these episodes is I release the episode, and then within a few days after, the Venmos come in. And people tell me which episode the Venmos are for. Or the one-time PayPals come in. But like those one-time contributions, when someone listens to an episode and goes, "Oh, I want to give you $5 for that," or I want to give you $20 for that, or whatever amount it is, even if it's $1, that's how I know that the episode was valuable to people. And the Organ Transplant Network episode, even after I recorded it with my old microphone, the same one I'm now using again, I re-recorded the episode thinking maybe the money didn't come in because of the sound quality. That new version has been released for a few weeks now, and the money still didn't come in. I don't get it. I found that topic fascinating, and I thought you would too. And so to see that Garrick, who's been a producer forever, whose opinion I very much value, to see that you put an executive producer credit on that episode, it means a lot more than you probably thought that it would when you picked that one. So hell yeah. Thanks, Garrick. That means a lot. And that also puts that episode on the most valuable episodes list. Because I think it matters, like so many people need organs in this country and the system is broken. Like we need to know this. So yeah, I like that episode. I'm so happy to know you did too. So thank you, Garrick. You have helped my paranoia. And then finally, Sage Felker. Sage Felker now has five executive producer credits and added 2 more. So Sage, thank you very much for putting your name on Congressional Dish 218, Minerals Are the New Oil, which now, because of your credit, now has 4 executive producers on it. It's Sage, our coffee-infused nerd, David Deere, and Robert Carpenter. And that has that episode tied for the second most valuable episode of Congressional Dish. It's now tied with the National Endowment for Democracy episode. So if you have a favorite between Minerals Are the New Oil and National Endowment for Democracy, 1 more EP credit is going to make the difference there. And then Sage also put an EP credit on episode 201, What WTF is the Federal Reserve, which is an episode I did to examine what the Federal Reserve even is. And it turns out that it's kind of a part of our government, but not really. It's kind of private and made up of a bunch of bankers. And I'm not entirely sure I think it should exist. Like, I don't know. That episode kind of blew my mind. It's a very popular episode, which is probably why with Sage's executive producer credit, that episode now has 3 executive producers on it, shooting it up the list and making it tied for the 3rd most popular episode of Congressional Dish. So, Sage, you are shaking up the list, my friend. And so thank you, Matt, Garrick, and Sage, and all executive producers and producers at any level. I don't think you can understand how much your sustained support means to me, and not just because you're allowing me to do this full time as my career, but for me, just like mentally. I look at the most valuable episode list all the time when I need a reminder that I'm not alone in this. I read your names and I think about the amount of money that your sport has added up to over the years. And it makes me feel like I'm doing this with other people, that I have a team with me. And I know I do, but I need to be reminded of that sometimes, because when I'm making these episodes, I'm sitting by myself watching C-SPAN and trying not to lose my mind. So you are an essential part of this project. I couldn't keep it up without you. And it's cool to have a record of these crazy events in Congress. You know, I do feel very lucky to do this job with you and to write the history of all this as we see it in real time. So thank you for making this job possible, for this podcast possible. I'm glad it exists on days like today. And thank you also to Claire for your hard work in collecting the sound clips for this episode. I made that poor thing read the congressional record, which is a congressional form of torture, and she did a really good job pulling clips for us to help you hear for yourself what happened on the floor during these crazy couple of weeks. And I couldn't afford to torture Claire without producers. So just thank you to everyone who participates in this project. Thank you to Mike for editing it. Thank you to everyone, because we have a lot more ahead to document this year, I'm pretty sure. And so with that, I have nothing to preview for you for the next episode, because who the knows what's going to happen. But I am sitting here watching C-SPAN and taking notes, and so I will let you know as soon as I know. So again, please share the show, pay for it if you can, and if you want real-time updates, follow Jen Briney on Twitter and Instagram, and follow Congressional Dish everywhere on social media. All right. Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.